High in the crow's nest of the new White Star liner Titanic, lookout Frederick Fleet peered into the dazzling night. It was calm, clear, and bitterly cold. There was no moon, but the cloudless sky blazed with stars. The Atlantic was like polished glass. People later said that they had never seen it so smooth. Suddenly, Fleet saw something directly ahead, even darker than the darkness. At first it was small, about the size he thought of 2 tables put together. But every second it grew larger and closer. Quickly, Fleet banged the crow's nest bell 3 times, the warning of danger ahead. At the same time, he lifted the phone and rang the bridge. "What did you see?" asked the calm voice on the other end. "Iceberg, right ahead," replied Fleet.
Welcome to our Gem Pursuit. I'm your host, Matthew Weldon, and joining me, who eloquently read that quote about the moment the iceberg was spotted in front of the Titanic, is my trustiest of co-hosts, Elise Ketcher. Hello, Elise.
Hi, Matthew, and welcome, everyone.
We are going to pick up exactly where we left off the last day, Elise. This is part 2 of our Titanic series. The ship is about to go down. Let's get started.
So as you would have heard in the beginning of our episode today, that was a little excerpt that was actually taken from a book that was called A Night to Remember. Well, that is still called A Night to Remember. That particular book is probably one of the best kept first account experience about what happened that night. It was also turned into a movie, so previous to the very famous James Cameron movie. But it gives us a lot of insight into what was happening on that night. But also it kind of lets us know a little bit more about why people thought it was unsinkable, why it actually did sink, and of course, the moments before the iceberg actually was struck.
When I was in school, when I was about 6 or 7 years old, we had a write a book competition. And I actually wrote a book on the Titanic, which is
interesting.
Which is somewhere at home. I don't know where. Well, I mean, I'm loosely using the term book there.
I better not find this book, Matthew, and it's like a picture of a ship on like a A4 piece of paper.
No, it's about 10 A4 sheets of paper, and it's got a little.
Okay, well, that's okay.
But it's bound.
Then it is a book.
We've got 2 really interesting but also tragic stories picked out that focus on the jewels that were on board that they've got back, right? So can't wait to get a look and discuss those. But I think it's important that we just understand, why the ship was considered unsinkable. I've never been on a boat before in my life and thought, there's no way this boat couldn't sink.
But I think maybe that's because you know of the Titanic now. Like it's definitely in all of our psyches now that anything that's on water can go down. I think the Titanic changed everybody's perception of sea travel.
I wonder, would it be the equivalent of 9/11, whereby security around airlines changed after that terrible disaster? After the Titanic, sea safety changed dramatically as well. So I think most people would be aware that there wasn't enough lifeboats on the Titanic. They thought this was the gold standard of sea travel.
Didn't want it clogging up the promenades around the boat for the first class passengers. They're like, we want space for people to walk and to promenade. And of course, women were wearing very large dresses at those times as well. So it would have meant that the space would have looked not aesthetically pleasing.
But don't you think it's strange that, and this is what I always thought, is that they realised that they needed to have some life. Like they didn't just say, there's no need for no lifeboats. They were like, we need some lifeboats. So they were kind of saying, it's possible that something could happen. I would have thought it would be like no lifeboats are enough lifeboats for everybody. But Titanic was divided into 16 compartments. I think they called them bulkheads, and they had watertight doors. Right? So if you imagine the Titanic, and if you look at it from the side, there was 16 sections to it. And these watertight bulkheads went up quite far on the ship, not to the top, but they went up quite high. And basically, they were designed that if there was a breach in the hull, and by the way, the hull was also reinforced, and this is the first time they had like this reinforced hull. So that alone made them think that it would be unsinkable. But okay, reinforced hull. But if there was a breach, the ship could stay afloat with 4 of these compartments flooded, which means there'd have to be an enormous gash on the side of the ship. The water was so calm, which actually made it even more difficult to see, because normally there'd be waves crashing up against it. Eventually, when they did, they turned the ship, but the iceberg, as you all know, an iceberg you only see 10%, 90% is under the water, and it hit the side of the ship, and it breached 5 of the watertight compartments, right? They shut the watertight doors, but what happened was, because 5 of them were breached, the ship started to dip at the front. When it dipped at the front, the water started spilling over into the other watertight compartments. So essentially they all filled up, and that's how ultimately the unsinkable ship sank.
This is interesting as well, because if it had only been 4, it would have been able to stay buoyant.
Well, they think if they had hit it straight on, if they had done nothing, they would have had a better chance of survival. I suppose it's all speculation now.
So the timeline, we're going to go over really quickly the timeline of what actually happened after the iceberg was struck. Now, this is important because when we see the movie adaptations, or you read the books, or everything that we know about Titanic sinking, almost seems like it takes a really long time in some aspects. And then in some aspects, it's like everything's going down really fast. But just to give you an understanding, it was actually on the 14th of April 1912 when the iceberg is actually struck at 11:40 p.m. Obviously, it turns into the 15th of April because it's midnight.
Which is actually today.
Which is today,
Yeah.
the day that we're actually recording.
113 years later.
And at 12:05, the crew makes the first attempts to get passengers into lifeboats. The ship is still afloat, and everybody kind of feels like this is a huge inconvenience. Like, why do you have us up out of bed? Obviously, they haven't told everybody that the ship is going to sink. They're trying to keep people very calm. But it's inevitable at this stage that it's definitely going to happen. At 12:30 a.m., the Carpathia responds to Titanic's distress call and starts to head to its location. However, it's still 58 miles away, so it's not going to make it in time for when the ship actually sinks to save the passengers. At 12:45, Captain Edward Smith gives the order to abandon ship. Lifeboats are launched, but many people won't go in them. So they're not full. And this is again where huge mistakes are made in actually the removal of passengers from the ship, especially since there's very little lifeboats anyway. Not having them full is a big, big, big mistake. At 1:10 a.m., the Titanic's final distress signal is sent and the ship starts to list heavily to its left side. This is panic mode now. And if you think about it, it's 11:40 to 1:30. To 1:10. That's not a long period of time before this is going to happen. It's going down. By 1:30 a.m., the stern of the Titanic is out of the water. That's the back of the ship. We're literally fully upright in the water now. And when this happens, it's so heavy that the back of the ship splits. And by 2:20 a.m., Titanic is completely gone.
It's quick. It is quick. Like it is, because although it's, as you said, 11:40 to kind of 2:20, for the first hour, the captain didn't give the order to abandon ship. So by the time there is clarity that they have to get off, it is 2 hours to completely sinking. So like the last hour, there's probably water everywhere. So it's really an hour to get things organized.
And for the people who are left on the ship or have basically jumped into the water at this stage after the sinking of the ship, there's people in the water still alive. They have the horrible wait from 2:20 a.m. to 4 a.m. when the Carpathia actually arrives at the scene to rescue survivors. And obviously, we're looking at almost 2 full hours in freezing cold water. And this kind of water actually has an iceberg in it. So this is how freezing cold the water is.
It's salt water. If it was fresh water, it'd probably be frozen. But the fact that it's the sea and therefore moving a lot, and also that salt water, that's why it's actually, like, I think it was 4 degrees the water or something on that particular night, which, you know, the Irish Sea, which I know you swim in the odd time, even as cold, it gets down to like 11, 12 degrees.
And that's freezing.
That's freezing. But this goes down to 4 Celsius, which I'm not sure what in Fahrenheit is. 39.2, which doesn't sound as bad.
The whole situation would have been extremely harrowing. Even if you were in a lifeboat, you would have been hearing the screams of people.
It would have been terrifying.
And women as well who didn't get on the boats were wearing very, very large dresses because of the time period that we're talking about. So you can imagine like so many layers of clothes then put into water. You wouldn't be able to keep yourself up out of the water with that amount of clothing wet. 8 a.m. is when the Carpathia departs and only 700 survivors. It's just devastating for not only the people involved, the cruise liner, everyone of the period would have just been astounded by the loss of life in this. Before we get on to our 2 very important stories, let's talk really quickly about the class distinctions, the way in which people were removed from the ship and taken to safety had a lot to do with how much money they paid to be on board.
For example, first class, once the iceberg was struck and they decided that there was an evacuation, you know, they went around, they knocked on all the doors, they told people that, you know, there's been an accident and you need to get to the lifeboats. I'm going to say relatively orderly, you know, because there was no hard and fast policy to evacuating a ship. You know, they never, of course they had these policies, but they never thought they'd actually need them. Then you've obviously got the cabins located lower down in the ship, right? So the 3rd class cabins, most of the barriers, and again depicted in the film, well, a lot of them were opened. It is perceived that they were all locked. It wasn't like that at all. Some of them probably were locked, but a lot of them were open. But the problem was for the people who had the open barriers is the Titanic, as we all know, was an enormous ship and it had a maze of corridors. So and think of if the ship is listing, it would be so disorientating. So even if you had access to get out in a listing ship, you know, in the panic and the chaos, very easy to get lost, very easy. And also, a lot of people on the Titanic, especially in 3rd class and possibly 2nd class, actually didn't speak English. So confusion, I think, is probably the best word. And this language barrier actually contributed quite a lot to the higher mortality rate among 3rd class passengers, simply because they just didn't understand what was going on.
It's actually terrifying to think of. It's just one of those situations where if you put yourself in the Titanic and you think about, number one, being stuck somewhere, not knowing how to get out of it because it's a maze-like, and also all of these corridors I'm sure looked exactly the same. So you could be going around in circles and not knowing, but also then actually getting up to where you're supposed to be and realizing that there's not enough lifeboats for you would have also been terrifying. But as a result of not having enough lifeboats, also women and children were given priority over men to get onto the lifeboats, and also age was a huge factor as well. So if you were a teenager, for instance, or even in your 20s, you would have been seen as a priority over some of the elderly, for instance. But as a result, it's calculated that out of 1,662 men that were on board, 1,347 of them lost their lives. So a lot of widows from the ship as well, who would have thought that their husbands would have been okay, and then realized later that getting onto the lifeboat meant a life without their husband. And also of the first class passengers, 63% of them had a survival rate, which meant that about 200, just over 200 people survived from first class.
So 25% of third class passengers and 63% of first class passengers. That's a pretty stark statistic.
Yeah, very, very damning. And also then, of course, out of the crew members, 900 crew members, about 76% lost their lives. So most of them going down with the ship, or obviously giving priority to passengers to get on board the lifeboats.
Yeah, they kept the engineers, they really worked hard to keep the ship's electricity running so that everybody could see where they were going. Because once that went, you would have been in absolutely complete darkness in the middle of the ocean. So
Absolute heroes.
So we've picked two stories from the Titanic, Elise, to focus on, and both have a really cool jewellery element to them. I mean, and again, when you think about the people who were traveling in the Titanic, and in our first episode, we mentioned some of the incredible jewellery that was claimed for after the ship sank. This one, I think, this first story that we're going to focus on, I find really interesting because looking at the jewels involved, it's like looking into the cabinets in our shop, because it's Edwardian, a lot of the time English and Irish jewellery. And I was looking at some of the pieces like that literally could be a piece that we'd have in stock.
The first story that we're going to talk about is actually something that was recovered from the Titanic. So, and we're not talking about something that was floating on the surface. We're talking about something that was actually removed from the seabed in the 1980s. Absolutely incredible stuff here. But to get to that point, we first have to talk about the purser on the ship. So a purser is someone who is on board usually very luxurious ships, and they are in charge of taking valuables and expensive items that are on board and keeping them safe. So they have a safe on board. They also have lock boxes. They also take care of any important communications that are coming into the ship that go to passengers on board. They also take money for things like if you wanted to go to the Turkish baths that day, or if you wanted to use one of the ship's facilities, you would come down to the purser and the purser would organize it and take payment for that. So, of course, the Titanic being the ship that it was, with every bell and whistle of the time, the purser's role on this ship was crucial. Absolutely crucial. Needed to be extremely organized, and also, of course, needed to know what jewelry belonged to who, keeping things safe, always had very important information that he had to take care of. Now, the purser for the Titanic, his office was actually right next to the grand staircase. So if you think about going back to the movie, if you've seen it, and the iconic part where Jack is standing at the bottom of the staircase and Rose is coming down this grand staircase. If you're Jack at the bottom, his office literally would have been to Jack's right. If you're looking up at Kate Winslet, it's right there on the right, or Rose, I should say, not take you out of the fantasy. And his office would have had the safe in it, all of these lock boxes, pigeonholes, all of this kind of thing. The purser's name was Hugh McElroy. Now, Hugh was adored, absolutely adored on this ship. Okay, he was known as kind of like being extremely charismatic, and usually crew members were not allowed to converse in a like non-professional way with those who were on board. So it meant that they didn't dine with them and they didn't have any kind of like personal conversations with them. They were very much staff and, crew and passengers. But Hugh was a little bit different.
When you think about his role, like obviously the captain was responsible for everything. A lot of the crew would have been responsible then for making sure the ship worked properly, mechanically, and so on. And then a lot of them obviously were terms of service, so in terms of dinners, etc. He really was the top dog when it came to client-facing work. So, as you said, he was very charismatic and extremely popular amongst these guests.
Okay, so on the night of the sinking, obviously the first place that people were heading to would have been the purser. Number one, because they had valuable items with him, but also because he was so trusted that they went to him to be convinced that this was actually happening. And on the night of the sinking, he actually was attending dinner in the first class dining salon. And many people said that they saw him during the evacuation, obviously trying to help people get their things, but also help them to evacuate off of the ship. This kind of ends in a really sad way because he doesn't survive. Hugh actually passes away during the sinking. However, it's a long time before they find him because he's not wearing his uniform. Because he was at dinner, he was actually wearing a white dining jacket. They actually did recover his body, which had a letter to his sister Maggie in one of his pockets. But that's how they were able to identify him. Usually they would have identified him through his uniform. But in this particular case, they were able to retrieve that letter. And I'm sure his sister Mary, sorry, not Maggie, his sister Mary would have been really appreciative of getting that letter that was on him. However, miraculously, part of what was considered the purser's collection of items that belonged to passengers was actually retrieved from the ocean floor. In an operation that was conducted in 1987, they, number one, found the shipwreck of the Titanic on the Atlantic Ocean floor, but they also found a bag, a purser's bag, close to the Titanic on the ocean floor. Now, how this particular bag stayed intact is really the crazy part of this story and is a testament to the craftsmanship of the Edwardian period.
Yeah, they don't make bags like that anymore. Made of leather, treated with oils and tannins to protect it, to kind of make it basically waterproof, right? Now, obviously, water seeped into it, but the fact was kind of like, I imagine it's kind of like a wetsuit, right? The water seeps in, but it's the same water that stays there and your body heats it up. This bag obviously water would have seeped into it, but because it was broadly waterproof, it wouldn't have had the water passing in and through it like all the other pieces, and that protected it really well, but also all of the pieces within it. So 75 years later, they found this purser's bag, which has been exhibited in many different Titanic exhibitions, including one in Atlanta in 2013. And there's even, they actually even have a photo of the robot finding this bag on the ocean floor. And it's incredible. It's like a duffel bag. But when you look at this photo and it's on the floor, it looks in absolutely fine condition. Like the
only thing that's missing really is like part of the handles are like eaten off. But the fact that it was still there like 75 years later is absolutely amazing. But what's even more amazing is what was recovered from inside the bag.
I mean, looking at the photos of these jewelries, like these jewels, Elise.
He's getting excited, people.
Yeah,
these jewelries.
Look at all these jewels. Let's just talk about some of the pieces. First of all, Edwardian jewelry, extremely finely made with valuable gemstones. Sapphires were popular, diamonds were popular.
Everything was popular.
Platinum was the metal of choice. Some had gold and platinum. But let's just talk about a couple of the pieces. They've got one 3-stone diamond ring, which is a really beautiful one. I'd actually really like to have one like it. It's got 2 old European cuts, one on each side. And in the middle, it's got this really nice Pendlelock old cut diamond, which is larger than the side 2 stones, set in platinum and bezel set with mill grain setting. Like really, really beautiful 3-stone ring. And again, one that we would love to have something like this in stock.
One which we would have had something similar to. And it just really is a testament to the time period. We know what the styles are, and these are typical Edwardian pieces. The next piece is actually a cluster piece that is set with a sapphire with diamonds surrounding. But this, again, is very typical Edwardian because we have platinum almost lace work that's done in radiating petals from a central sapphire in the center. But all of the settings are done in platinum, whereas the surround and backing are all in yellow gold, which is a very, very typical design feature of the Edwardian period. And of course, very feminine looking, very pretty, typical of the pretty period.
And the sapphire is a beautiful color as well. But the photo that we have of this sapphire, and we'll post them on our Instagram, it almost looks like one of our catalogue shots that we do for our website. But, I mean, next you've got this beautiful Edwardian platinum brooch with floral detail, like, you know, very fine platinum work. That to me actually is absolutely the epitome of garland era Edwardian jewellery.
Yeah,
really
this
beautiful.
is a theme that ran through many of the jewellery items, especially since the coronation of King Edward VII, because a lot of his tiaras that were featured during the coronation and were created specifically for the coronation had this garland style to it, which is, of course, how the Edwardian era got the nickname the Garland era. But all of that beautiful floral and folate detail is open work and done with platinum, and it looks so fine. And the fact that so much pressure from the ocean was on top of this for 75 years and it still looks exactly the same way that it did the 75 years prior is just outstanding. And it just, again, it looks so delicate. You would think that it wouldn't survive something like that. But platinum being so strong and diamonds also being the hardest material, even after that amount of time on the ocean floor, it still looks pristine.
I'm not a physicist, although my brother who lives in Spain is a physicist. So if you're hearing this, Dennis, let me know. But how, I don't understand how they weren't damaged. Maybe it's something to do with the bag and the water pressure equalized somehow between the bag. I'm not sure, but they really look like they were made yesterday. And the middle grain is like so fresh, you know. And the next piece is a panel ring Edwardian. I can even see the 18 karat gold platinum hallmark on it. Well, it's not a hallmark; it's stamped by the jeweler. That is a beautiful piece. Some green enamel cufflinks. In fact, more than just cufflinks, a green enamel button set and cufflinks. We actually have a set like that downstairs as well. We bought it the other day. There's watches and there was other pieces, but
There's
one,
brooches, watches, keys. Yeah.
You know, the little heart, little ribbon bow with the 2 old cut diamonds. That's such a pretty old brooch, but again, survived well. And also, sorry, I mentioned this one to you at the start, the Amy bracelet, which I look at this and it's like, I was like, is this 120 years old? But it is. It's curbling chain in yellow gold with a platinum section in Edwardian script that spells out Amy. Now, Edwardian script is that kind of fancy writing that you see, and it's set with diamonds. And I remember we had this brooch that said 1902. Remember that? And It looks exactly like that type of script, but obviously this one is in a bracelet rather than a brooch.
And that was an Edwardian piece because it was a commemorative piece for the coronation of King Edward VII. And this was all found in the Gladstone bag, which is obviously now very famous. It's part of the collections of the RMS Titanic Incorporated. There's lots of information out there about it. There's YouTube videos about it as well. But the Gladstone bag discovery is perhaps one of the greatest time capsules from the Titanic that we've ever recovered.
So the second story we'd like to focus on, Elise, is of one of the wealthiest first-class passengers, and obviously they would have had a lot of direct contact with Hugh McElroy. And this is a tragic story, and of course, everyone who died on the Titanic or who passed away was a tragic story, but it also had an inspiring element to it, which I think we need to talk about.
I think as well, it's about the documentation. Nothing becomes quite so real until you know the story of something. So, for an example, like we have Mizpah rings, for instance, that are within our collection. And to anybody who doesn't know the story of a Mizpah ring, they automatically are just like, oh, it's a ring that has like some writing on it. Once you understand the story behind why the writing is on it, that it's a gift that's given between two people who are going to be separated for a long period of time, it becomes more than just a ring with some writing on it. And this is what this story is about. Yes, the Titanic sunk. And when we talk about people dying and we're like, oh, 63% of these people died and 25% of these people died, we have to actually remember that these are individuals with lives. And once we bring that to life, once we understand the backstories of these people, we understand more about what was lost on this night.
Yeah, and I think we always say that to people, when the jewellery is always worth more for what it means than what it is. And I know when we're doing repairs and stuff, I always get way more nervous when it's something that's extremely sentimental than if it's a high value piece.
Absolutely.
I'm like, okay, so
you can't replace that. You can't replace the sentimentality.
So Isidore and Ida Strauss. Well, Isidore, firstly, a lot of people might not know this, but he actually was the co-owner of the Macy's department store with his brother, Nathan. He was also a politician. He served for over a year in the United States House of Representatives representing New York. He was 67 years old, boarding the Titanic from Southampton, which we all know was not the last stop, but nearly there. And his wife, Ida, was 63, and they also had an entourage as they went on to the boat, but luckily their daughter actually didn't get on. Beatrice decided to stay a bit longer and luckily didn't get on the Titanic, as it turned out. She was probably devastated at the time, thought it would be a cool journey, but obviously worked out that she didn't, right? So on the night of the sinking, they were seen standing, and as you said, the documentation, this is what makes it. There's eyewitness accounts of this, which is really cool. So they were seen standing near lifeboat number 8, along with their maid, Ellen Bird. Ellen Bird was encouraged by her employers, get on the boat, get on the boat. And Ida was also about to get on the boat, but she realised that Isidore was not going to be getting on. So she actually stayed on board the boat, but, absolutely had the opportunity to board one of the lifeboats. As we were talking about the different classes in the boats and how they organised the evacuation, she would have been one of the first ones up.
Yes. Also, because of Isidore's age and standing, he was offered a place on the boat as well, but he didn't feel like it was a gentlemanly thing to do when there were so many women and children still aboard the ship. He was like, absolutely not. This space is not going to be for me. It's for women and children. And even though he was urging Ida to get on board, she is documented as refusing and quoted as saying, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." And so she stays behind. It's they're of Jewish descent as well. And if you've ever read the book of Ruth or the story of Ruth, Ruth also is told to go back to her people. And she says, no, your people are my people. And she stays with her mother-in-law after her husband dies, and she says, your people are my people, and she stays. And I think that those parallels of this story also touch a nerve there, because she is then kind of remembered as sacrificing herself.
Well, she knew it was a sacrifice. When she went back from the lifeboat, she gave her fur coat to her maid and basically said to her, I ain't going to need this anymore. So she consciously, as you said, decided to sacrifice herself. I mean, to stay with her husband, I suppose. And as you said, he was also offered a place. So, like, this is a story of, I think, bravery, loyalty. And rabbis spoke to their congregations about their sacrifice. Articles in Yiddish and the German language newspaper extolled her courage. And it was a popular song featuring the story, The Titanic Disaster. It became a bit of very popular among Jewish Americans. And the nod in the film we're talking about is, the scene when the elderly couple are in their bed and the water's rushing underneath them.
And they're both lying in the bed together and they're holding one another. That is supposed to be Ida and Isidore Strauss, which I think that's probably one of the most poignant parts in the film, where you realize that people know that they're going to die in this tragedy, but they're together. So, it gives them some form of comfort knowing that they're with each other, even though that this is unfolding around them. This links back to the jewellery that was recovered, because Isidore's body was actually recovered when they were removing people out of the ocean, but Ida's body was never found. But on Isidore's body, his wedding ring was still intact on his hand. He also had a few other effects on him. They said that his clothing that he was wearing was a fur-lined overcoat. He was wearing grey trousers, a coat and vest, a soft striped shirt, brown boots, and black silk socks. On his person, he had a pocketbook, a gold watch, platinum and pearl chain, a gold pencil case, a silver flask, silver salts bottle, 40 pounds in notes, 4 pounds, 2 shillings, and 3 dimes in silver. And of course, his wedding ring, which now is a part of a
you can see
exhibit.
I think, today. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we haven't seen this one, unfortunately. We'd love to go see this. But 6,000 people attended a service for them at Carnegie Hall, though, in May 12th, 1912. So, I mean, as you said, it is a tragedy, though. I think the point you said is very important. Even in that terrible situation and tragedy, I think they did get some comfort from each other in the last few moments. And it's probably just one of many stories like this on the Titanic. We'll wrap it up there on our 2-part series on the Titanic. And, as we mentioned in the recording there, we're actually recording this purely by chance on the anniversary of the Titanic, 113 years later. And I think, I really enjoyed this 2-part series, at least. Thank you very much for joining me on this gem pursuit.
Thanks, Matthew.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure you're subscribed or following on your platform of choice. That way you can always stay up to date with the new episode as we release them. experts@courtville.ie is the email address for any questions or comments. And you know what? Elise and I, we really love hearing these from you, so don't hesitate to get in touch. This episode was produced by Ross Hannon of Tape Deck, with project management and research by Veronique Galgan and Fenia Scudi. Until the next time, from me, Matthew Weldon, good luck and Godspeed.